Welcome to the critique. Today, we are dismantling Park Min-hye's argument that humanity is an accidental product of chance, meaning we should abandon the search for purpose and just focus on biological permanence and personal happiness.
The text establishes a fundamental contradiction by first arguing that life has no meaning, but then immediately assigning a rigid, mandatory goal of biological permanence.
Right. It's a bit of a whiplash moment for the reader. Let's unpack the exact weakness in the logic there.
Yeah. So the weakness is explicitly in that friction between his premise and his conclusion. The author states that asking, why were we born is just a foolish question because we are products of chance, mere coincidences of the universe.
Right? A very clear nihilistic stance.
Exactly. He writes that we weren't born for a reason, but then, almost immediately, the text pivots to a very prescriptive purpose. It says, our life's goal is ensuring biological permanence.
Which sounds a lot like a reason.
Right. It argues that passing on genes or cultural heritage is a duty, and basically the only form of eternal life. This creates a massive logical friction.
Because if the universe provides no meaning, like if it is truly just a roll of the dice, where does this moral imperative to ensure the survival of the species even come from?
Exactly. It's a logical non sequitur. He explicitly removes the commander, God or fate, but leaves the commandment, thou shalt survive.
It feels like he's sneaking a meaning back in through the back door of biology.
Yeah, he replaces God with DNA, but the religious structure of having a duty remains completely intact.
So what is the suggestion for improvement here? How does he resolve this without breaking the premise of the entire piece?
The argument needs to distinguish between inherent meaning and functional meaning. Inherent meaning would be given by the universe, which he rejects. Functional meaning is just derived from evolutionary drives. He's currently treating them as the same thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Do we have a concrete example of how he can clarify this distinction in the text?
Yes, and it's actually one of the most memorable parts of the material. We can refine the section on the sea squirt.
Oh, right, the animal that eats its own brain.
Right, it swims around looking for a rock, and once it attaches, it eats its own brain because it no longer needs to move. The author uses this to argue that the mind is just a tool for movement.
It's a very vivid image. Once the goal is reached, the brain is unnecessary.
It is. But he can use this way more effectively. Instead of just using the sea squirt to diminish the importance of the mind, he should use it to explain that purpose is merely a biological mechanism for survival. It's not a moral truth.
Ah, I see. So the sea squirt doesn't have a cosmic duty to stick to the rock.
Exactly. It just has a program. So, specifically, regarding the phrasing, instead of saying, the permanent goal is biological permanence, which sounds like a commandment, he should rephrase it as, our biological programming compels us toward permanence.
That's a subtle but powerful shift. It moves the statement from a philosophical should to a biological is.
Precisely. It removes the contradiction of assigning a high-minded goal to a meaningless existence. It keeps the nihilistic logic intact while acknowledging the biological reality.
The directive to live happily is logically undermined by the text's own statistical breakdown of human existence as predominantly painful. This brings us to the central advice of the text regarding how we should actually spend our days.
This was the point where I felt the text was fighting against itself the hardest. The math just creates a trap.
It really does. The weakness here is that the author instructs the reader to, quote, live my life completely, enjoying it perfectly and happily.
Which is a very high bar.
Right? Perfectly and happily. But simultaneously, the text claims that life is 70% suffering, 20% peace, and 10% joy.
And he even goes into detail about hedonic adaptation. He notes that pleasure inevitably transforms into pain or addiction.
Exactly. He mentions that hunger is pain, and eating relieves it, but that satisfaction is fleeting.
Yeah, it's the classic cycle of samsara.
So if the premise is that pain is the default state 70% of the time, and pleasure is both fleeting and dangerous, the command to live happily sets the reader up for inevitable failure.
Yeah, it's logical incoherence. You cannot perfectly enjoy a system that is designed to be mostly suffering.
It's like handing someone a heavy backpack and telling them to float.
That's a great way to put it. If the operating system is suffering, the user manual shouldn't be have fun. So what's our suggestion for improvement here?
We need to shift the core recommendation from happiness, which the text clearly equates with that fleeting 10% of pleasure, to peace or acceptance.
Because peace actually accounts for the 20% slice of the pie?
Exactly. And it's a much more stable state. For a concrete example, let's look at the analogy he uses. Hunger is pain, but as soon as you eat, that pain turns into pleasure.
Right, he uses that to explain why pleasure is temporary.
Yes, but he should use this to argue that the goal isn't pleasure because that vanishes the moment you are full. The goal is the management of pain.
So it becomes about equilibrium rather than ecstasy.
Exactly. I would rewrite the slogan entirely. Instead of, we just have to live happily, change it to, we just have to live by expanding the 20% of peace.
That aligns much better with his reference to the Buddha, too. The idea that pleasure turning into suffering is all suffering.
Right. It lowers the stakes and makes the advice actually achievable within the grim statistics he's provided.
It transforms the text from kind of a wishful thinking exercise into an actual survival guide. It feels more stoic.
Precisely. You can't be a pessimist about the world and an optimist about the goal. You have to align them.
The metaphor of heaven is applied inconsistently to two mutually exclusive states, which are conscious existence and total non-existence. This is the next major structural crack we need to look at.
The afterlife concept, or rather, the lack of an afterlife.
Right. The text makes a really strong case for eliminating the fear of death, but the metaphor he uses involves a collision.
The argument is that we came from nothing and returned to nothing, and that pre-birth state was peaceful, right?
Correct. The weakness lies in the valuation of those states. The author argues that the previous 36.7 billion years before birth were heaven because there was no pain, fear, or sadness.
Exactly, and the answer is no. So, non-existence is heaven type A. But simultaneously, the author argues that only this place that exists is heaven, and we must build heaven on earth.
Oh, I see the conflict.
Yeah, it completely confuses the incentive structure. If non-existence is painless, let's call that heaven A, and existence is 70% suffering, heaven B, then logically, non-existence is the superior state.
Which completely undermines his entire motivation to prolong life or ensure biological permanence.
Exactly. Why would I want to prolong a 70% suffering state if the alternative is billions of years of painless bliss? If the void is so great, why stick around?
It actually acts as an argument against his previous point. So the suggestion for improvement here? We need to clarify the definitions. The text needs to differentiate between nirvana or oblivion, the peace of non-being, and paradise, the joy of being. They cannot both be heaven in the same sentence without confusing the reader about which one is actually the goal.
So how do we provide a concrete example to rewrite that section and save the incentive to live?
I would take the section discussing the 36.7 billion years and explicitly frame it as peaceful oblivion rather than heaven. Heaven implies a reward, or a place you actively want to be. Oblivion is just neutral. It's the absence of negatives, but not the presence of positives. And then how do we handle the heaven on earth part? In the section where he says heaven must be created here, he should acknowledge the difficulty. He needs to say that creating heaven on earth is a harder version of existence than the peace of oblivion, but it is the only one worth striving for because of the unique capacity to experience that 10% joy.
Right. He needs to sell the joy part as being worth the suffering price tag. Otherwise, the void just wins the argument.
Exactly. It changes the choice from heaven versus heaven to the peace of sleep versus the adventure of being awake.
And even if being awake is painful, it's the only game in town where you can feel anything at all.
Right. Which feels much more honest to his material and gives the reader an actual logical reason to get out of bed.
The argument for extreme self-reliance and the rejection of the positive golden rule conflicts with the later emphasis on symbiosis and ecosystem diversity. That's the final major area I want to tackle.
Yeah, the text has a very strong individualist streak, almost libertarian in its approach to making a living.
It really does. And the weakness is in the practical application of this. The text advises that the beginning of all good is my own fault, and tells the reader to solve the problem of making a living yourself.
He explicitly critiques doing good for others unasked as violence.
Right.
He says forcing someone to go to heaven with me is violence, which is a fair point in a vacuum. Unsolicited advice can be harmful.
Sure.
Yet he concludes that we are part of a complex food chain where symbiosis, parasitism, sacrifice, and competition are all linked to increased survival chances. He praises the diversity of the ecosystem.
So he oscillates between leave me alone and we are all one.
Exactly. And the critique here is that you cannot have a functioning ecosystem if every agent acts solely on freedom without goals and refuses to engage proactively with others for fear of committing violence.
Right, because symbiosis requires interaction.
If I never do anything for you unless you ask, and you never ask because you're solving it yourself, the entire ecosystem collapses.
It becomes a grid of isolated points rather than a web. You can't have a food chain if everyone is conscientiously objecting to participating in the chain.
So the suggestion for improvement is to reconcile individual responsibility with systemic participation. We need to bridge the gap between don't bother people and we need each other to survive.
Do we have a concrete example of how to bridge that without violating his violence principle? Because he seems very attached to the idea that imposing one's will is wrong.
We can look at the anecdote he gives about the Tibetan monk petting the snow leopard.
I love that story. The leopard kills a sheep, but the monk understands it's not evil, it's just nature.
Right, we'll use that. The anecdote suggests an understanding of nature's lack of good and evil. We can use this to argue that while we shouldn't force moral values on others, because that's the violence, proactive cooperation or mutual aid is completely natural.
So it's not violence to help, it's violence to convert.
That is a sharp distinction, yes. And regarding the golden rule, he dislikes do to others as you would have them do to you. He prefers the negative version, don't do to others.
Because doing things for people implies imposing your will.
Right. But we can refine this. Instead of dismissing the positive golden rule, qualify it. Say do to others what they need for survival, not what you think they want for happiness.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It supports his biological permanence goal, keeping the species alive, without violating the freedom principle or imposing your specific version of heaven on them.
It aligns the ethics perfectly with the biology. If the goal is survival, then helping means ensuring survival, not forcing lifestyle choices. That resolves the conflict entirely.
It makes the philosophy robust enough to handle a society, not just a hermit living in a cave.
You know, this really brings me back to the start of our whole discussion. The text is clearly trying to do something very difficult, which is building a moral framework without a metaphysical foundation.
It's trying to build a house on shifting sand, or rather, on chance.
Exactly, which is why these structural critiques are so vital. If we recap, this piece is a fascinating blend of evolutionary biology, nihilism, and stoicism. It successfully strips away the metaphysical baggage, but struggles to rebuild a consistent purpose from the rubble.
So let's summarize the actionable suggestions for the listener to implement.
Right. First, reframe biological permanence as an inescapable instinct, not a cosmic duty, to avoid contradicting the meaninglessness premise. Second, replace the goal of happiness with peace or acceptance to align with the suffering statistics.
And third, resolve the two heavens conflict by distinguishing between the peace of the void and the potential of life. Don't call them both heaven. And finally, fix the ethics to allow for proactive symbiosis without labeling it violence.
It's really about tightening the screws so the machine doesn't shake itself apart when you turn it on.
The text asks us to look at a stone on the road and see an equal. It says, 200 years from now, we will realize that we and that stone lying on the road are precious beings of equal value.
It's a beautiful sentiment, a radical equality.
If the author can polish the logic as smooth as that stone, this argument will be absolutely unbreakable. We'd love to see the next draft. Please submit your work again to the critique.
Keep writing.
And keep questioning.